It's lovely to be here, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you today from the Squamish lands and reflecting on what we can take from our recognition of where we sit in Indigenous lands with regard to the traditional living knowledge of the people and these places, and bring that with us into our conversations. So I'll move into sharing my screen and proceed. So as you know, our topic today has to do with predatory publishers and conferences, knowing the risks and avoiding the hazards, and hopefully I'll give you a whirlwind tour through this very evolving field. Feel free to put questions that you have along the way in chat, and Marilee will decide how we can field those given time at the end. And as you'll gather, I have quite a lot to say about it, so I will speak quite quickly. This recording will be available following. If you miss a link or a reference point, that will be available following. And I hope that in presenting this, you can leave today with a little bit more confidence in your ability to judge the journals to which you submit your manuscripts and the conferences that you choose to attend, and enter this kind of risky, odd field with a little bit less anxiety. So we'll talk about what these predatory journals and conferences are, why it matters that you fully understand and make good decisions, talk a lot about how they catch you, the ways in which they try and trick you into submitting your work to them and using them as your publishers, and then how to avoid them. Hopefully you'll come away armed with a few more tools than you came into this discussion with. The language of predatory publishers is publishing is referring to an exploitive academic publishing model that involves charging publication fees to authors without really doing the formal legitimacy and credibility checks, the peer review kinds of checks that we've done, and without providing the editorial and publishing services that legitimate academic journals provide, whether open access or not. And they're considered deceptive because scholars essentially are tricked into publishing with some journals. And although authors sometimes actually are aware that the journals are poor quality and fraudulent, but I'm assuming that most of you would not voluntarily submit your work to a journal that you know to be fraudulent. You would understand the reasons that that wouldn't be such a good idea. Now, I think it's important to say at the outset that all predatory journals and publishers are open access, but not all open access journals are predatory. So it's important that distinction be made, that I'm not in any way challenging open access journals, because increasingly more and more journals are open access and more of them are fee-based. So fee-based open access does not necessarily mean predators. Now, it would be very easy, and I wouldn't have to talk for an hour, if there was a comprehensive list of all the journals and publishers that are predatory and to be avoided, and by default, all of the other ones that are legitimate. No comprehensive list exists, and the reason for that is that the list that everyone referred to, known as Beale's list, it was developed by Jeff Beale at the University of Colorado, a librarian who really tried to document both a list of standalone journals and also a list of publishers that were suspected of being possible or probable predatory journals. He did that, and it was an extremely useful resource up until 2015, when through lawsuits brought by some of these very large and now very powerful publishing houses that had been operating in this space, he was forced to close the list. So the old list is still accessible, although it's quite outdated by now, as you could imagine. People still refer to it, but that a lot of the information there is no longer credible, and many new journals have evolved since that time. He's since retired. Other groups have explored the possibility of creating a similar list, but the legal ramifications for any organization posting who is or isn't predatory have become too enormous to consider that likely opportunity. So we have to think of other ways to be able to make those decisions. The targets for many open access predatory predatory publishers are very often junior scholars, those who would be seen to be under pressure to publish because they're on a tenure track, for example. There's lots of targeting of scholars from developing countries who may find it difficult to get into standard mainstream and international journals, who may be more vulnerable, who may not understand the rules of an English language international publishing scene, for example. And I'm assuming if you've been in the world of academic work for any period of time, you will be barraged daily by invitations to submit your work to a manuscript. And so the solicitation is something that people who are in my position, having published for a long time, will have dozens of those perhaps every day. For some of you for whom it's new and they're just finding you because you've just published the first thing, or they've come to access your email address in some other way, it may be difficult to know whether they're really being addressed to you personally because somebody has something that they want to discuss with you, or whether you have been put on a list. But I want to try and help you understand how these lists work and how any of us can get caught. And I say that because any of us, even if we've been publishing for a very long period of time, can sometimes make decisions a little quickly and not necessarily do justice to our work. So I'm trying to help you prevent that. Why it matters is that once you submit a manuscript, and I'm talking about before they have done any peer review or accepted it, your manuscript may be lost to you. A journal can slap a DOI on it, a digital object identifier, and at that point they can hold copyright and might be very nasty to work with. There have been several stories of people who mistakenly submitted their journal to a manuscript thinking it was the legitimate manuscript they had or publisher they had in mind, and no longer hold the legal right to that manuscript because it has actually been submitted and the journal has slapped a DOI on it. Now, you might eventually win the right back to your manuscript back in court, but you can imagine that that's a very long and difficult process. You would have to be able to guarantee or demonstrate that it was gained under fraudulent purposes, and unfortunately, you're the one that submitted it. Now, if you've gone further and submitted it and they've accepted it and published it, and it's now appearing online, it does exist in the world of publications, and you can't legitimately erase it from your CV. Even if you were embarrassed about a publication and wish you hadn't sent it to a certain journal, it would be considered somewhat fraudulent in the academic world to pretend you had not authored a paper that someone might look online and Google you or something like that and identify you with. So unfortunately, you can't erase it from your CV. It stays with you. And then any dubious journals you have on your record might detract from your scholarly reputation over time as people start to look at it and think, those are questionable journals. Of course, the money you spend is money wasted, but also be aware, and I will speak later about this, that journals that you have published with may well use your name and university and reputation to target others, so that once it's published, your credibility adds credibility to that publisher. So how to spot trouble. For many of you, this is pretty easy. If you get lots of them every day, you will be used to it. Often the journal that sends you this letter is a journal in which you're not particularly doing research or writing, or wouldn't be doing it. So it could be something completely out of your field or marginally connected. Many of these solicitations have a tone of urgency about them. They want something by tomorrow. This was sent on January 11th, and they wanted an upcoming issue by January 17th. So you can see the urgency to prevent you from making a deliberative decision. They almost always flatter you greatly. This one is indicating that I'm an illustrious person. And you can see that there's sometimes some oddly worded language that cues you in that this would not be a credible editor for whom language use and precision with terminology would be the business of the day. So the idea that this prompt submission sustains us a lot and impacts my ranking, it would be something that would raise your eyebrows immediately. Very often, the solicitor will indicate how they've seen you, or really try and attract your attention. And it's amazing how often, even though hiring somebody to help them with English and their mass-wide targeting solicitations, you'd think that would be a fairly cheap innovation, but there are very often English language variations. There are also some very obscure references that are meant to give you some comfort, meant to have an illusion of credibility. But given what I just told you about the worst of the malpractice, the idea that they provide a DOI to all published papers, well, as does everyone, they may also slap that DOI on a little bit too early and refuse to let it go. Another example would be the use of names. This one struck me because the name Melanie Klein, for those of you who might have studied psychology, would know that this is a long dead trusted name in psychology, the kind of name that you would have a positive feeling for. So if you've ever studied in anything in the field of psychology, you might recognize the name Melanie Klein with affection, and it might feel to you like a name of somebody you've heard of before. When we look at this particular journal online, we see actually that the editor-in-chiefs, which is punctuated incorrectly, are two very different individuals, one in the US and the other in Egypt. So you can see the misleading aspect of that solicitation. We can also see ways of trying to suggest to you that these are listed in what you might think of as typical rankings, and some of these are really quite questionable. The World Journal Clout Index, for example, is an entity in China that's really trying to advance Chinese journals into the international scene. Here's an example of one that at face surface might seem like a journal that you've heard of, the name that you might have heard of. But if you look below into the publishing house, you start to be able to identify that this is a private scientific publishing house. And it is, in fact, one that has created a lot of difficulty. You can see here that its mission has to do with well-rounded works in developing science, education, and culture, so it's very general. And it does actually have a legal holding as a numbered company in Canada, even though it operates elsewhere. And digging further into the journals within this publishing house, you can see that some have, or this is another of those publishing houses, you can see that they often have very slick websites. At the surface, it looks like a very slick website, very similar to the kinds of websites you might see for a credible journal. But I'm referring you to the highlighted text here. And here as well, we see that it's quite problematic and has grammatical issues as well. So look past the flashy cover underneath the service. And how do you figure out what's credible in this whole domain? And this is the very tricky part. And we're long past the point where a fixed list will do, because things can change over time. Well, we're lucky at UBC because we do have a very good resource in the library under publishing a journal article. You can look that up in the university library. And it has lots of guidance on how to think through the things you know about a particular journal before you decide that you would want to consider. It expresses it in think, check, and submit, and has information about each of those 3 steps. But you can see, for example, the kinds of guidance it gives for what it means by checking your site. Do you or your colleagues know this journal? Is it something that you've read? Have you had references in your classes, for example, from publications in this particular journal? Can you identify and contact the publisher? Is the name visible, or is it a shadow name? The solicitation had a name that's very different that's on the website. And are the articles indexed in the indexing services that you know to be credible? And we'll speak more about that later. Others have to do with, do you recognize the editorial board? Are the editorial board members or the editor themselves credible members in your field? And do the editorial board members mention the journal on their own websites? Do they know that they're being listed in that way? Does the journal belong to the Committee on Publication Ethics and other kinds of organizations that you know to do a certain kind of scrutiny? So these are the kinds of guidance that you'll be given in that UBC website. Another source of some comfort about credible journals comes from Nurse, Author, and Editor, which is an entity of the International Academy of Nursing Editors. That's an organization that brings together credible editors of nursing journals to discuss these matters, such as predatory publishing and ethical policy in the evolving world of publishing ethics. Within this organization, there is a directory of nursing journals. And of course, it's my colleagues, all volunteer members of the credible nursing editor community, that do the scrutiny of work on these journals. But this is a community of people who are quite concerned, very concerned about misrepresentation to the body of nursing. And so if one of the members were to spot something that is in a journal that's listed that is inappropriate, that somehow managed to get onto this listing, they would speak up pretty quickly. So it's a reasonable way of having a look, and it explains to you how it identifies and determines who can be posted on that list. Another source that is helpful, although not a guaranteed source, is PubMed, which is produced by the National Library of Medicine. And it has very clear policies and procedures around how to evaluate the publishers and the journals, because sometimes there will be a publisher that publishes many journals. Some of those journals will meet the criteria for PubMed and some won't. And I should also say at this point that simply not being on PubMed may not mean that a journal is not credible. And this is because all of these services really do require considerable work on the part of the publisher or the journal editor. And if the journal is, for example, a society journal, a journal of a small society of members, such as the Canadian Oncology Nursing Journal, for example, all volunteer. So that group may not have the wherewithal to go through the many steps in order to get listed on these various devices. And many of them will take several years. It's not simply one application. It's a review of the total body of publications and processes over the course of several years. So just how you know that things get on this list. It is also possible that something once on the list starts to slip in its editorial practices, and it may take time before it's removed, but it is still a very good way. So you look in PubMed, Google PubMed, and check in the journal, and if it's listed, you'll find that it is giving some form of comfort. An additional way is the journal citation reports, because of all of the journals, if journals have made it onto the journal citation reports Clarivate puts out, that you know they've gone through an extremely high level of scrutiny. Now, I think that the number of journals that are rejected, this is a little bit older statistics, but I think that it points out that this is a highly rigorous review, and that a journal may take many years and many attempts before it gets itself into the JCR listings. And where a journal has applied and been rejected, that's a very clear indication that it has some obvious violations of ethical policy, and it cannot apply again for a few years. So the presence of a JCR impact factor is a pretty reliable indicator. If something gets into the Web of Science, it's met a very high bar. Again, the not having an impact factor may be a matter of the wealth and the wherewithal, the resources of a journal to be able to go through the rigors over several years to meet that bar over time. The other thing I should point out is that we're used to seeing these Clarivate journal citation reports listed as an impact factor. And if you look on a journal's website and it gives the JCR impact factor, that gives you an immediate sense of comfort. But be a little bit careful, because many journals who are being fraudulent will produce something that looks like another kind of an impact factor, or they may just say impact factor and give the number, usually a high number, but not, they're implying that it's a JCR impact factor, but it may be some other source. And there are many other fraudulent sources that are providing these for journals so that they can post them. So going into Web of Science and confirming that that journal does in fact exist there may be an extra step that is worth taking on occasion. All of the editors, journals, and publishers that are highly committed to ethical practices will be members of COPE, the Council on Publication Ethics, and they cannot put the logo of COPE on their journal website unless they have been through the review of that group. So organizations can be suspended or terminated from COPE, but the COPE signal in particular is a useful one. The Directory of Open Access Journals is sometimes used as a bit of a proxy, but it does not have quite the same level of rigorous review. It's more of a directory of all of them, and it will indicate some features of the ones that are successful. But be aware that these are some possible things to consider in looking up a particular journal as well. And as you can see, the kinds of things that these organizations screen for are very, very complex, many factors and many layers. So this is why it takes so much work in order to get the credibility rankings, to get JCR ranking, but it also reflects the kind of review that will be done by some of these organizations in deciding from year to year whether a journal can stay on the list or whether it might need to be removed. And now there are a number of other additional concerns that you'll run into in thinking about websites. Often these predators catch you by virtue of using a journal name that is identical to or similar to a journal that you know and trust. Now, this is in Earth Sciences, and most of you are not Icelandic Earth Sciences, but this is the classic example that gets used so often in the literature of a legitimate journal on Earth Sciences that has been hijacked by not credible journal using the same name, providing what appears to be an impact factor, and looking very like the kind of journal that would be credible in the field. It's got the same kinds of dimensions. And so this was an example in which many credible scholars mistakenly, simply by doing a Google search and going in, thought they had found the legitimate one and submitted. So just be aware that there are possibilities. I wasn't able to find an example in nursing that's current, and I think that says that people are pretty quick about trying to spot them and knowing what to do if one sees a hijacked journal. But this industry is one that is endlessly creative. And so it may well catch you, particularly if you were to follow the link in a solicitation email, rather than searching yourself but for the titles that you know and are trusted journals. There is also one of the added complications that we're having to deal with nowadays, and one of the reasons it has become impossible to create a fixed list of which are the journals or publishers that include some predatory practices, are that some of the journals that began with questionable practices have worked very hard to bring their journals up to legitimacy. Now, MDPI is a very large conglomeration operating out of Basel, Switzerland, at the moment at least, that runs many journals, probably about 360 journals. And in the early days, it was on Beall's list as a predatory publisher. It was removed following lawsuits, and these lawsuits were partly what caused the list to be downgraded. But since that time, MDPI has been an example of a publishing house that has worked extremely hard to improve its practices. And many of its journals, I think it's probably fair to say a majority of its journals have evolved in their practices to a point where they are now listed in PubMed. They have a JCR impact factor, and that they are operating in credible ways. These are two examples that have come up recently in Journal of Environmental Health and Environmental Research in Public Health and Current Oncology. These are examples of journals that your colleagues in nursing may well publish in, and they are behaving in credible ways. If those practices start to shift and the corporation starts to inflict some more questionable practices, they could in time lose that credibility. And the trick here is that there may well be some journals who at the time, if you were looking at a paper or you had a paper on your CV at the time that they published, they may not have been credible, but they've since become credible, or that they had credibility and then they lost that over time if they shifted in their publishing practices. So if you were just to review somebody's CV, to look at the credibility of journals, you would also need to look in some instances at what year the publication occurred to be able to draw an assessment as to whether that was submitted and accepted as in the context of a predatory publisher at the time, or whether in fact it was submitted in the context of accepted publishing practices. So you can see how that gets tricky. And but there have been a couple of these very large corporations that operate many journals that have been able to successfully bring some of their journals through to credibility. And in most cases, because they put an awful lot of effort and resources in order to do that, they will continue those credible publishing practices. Although there are still some footprints of the predators that you may see in some contexts, and I'll refer to them a little bit. In such publications, this one that I've just mentioned, MDPI, which was considered a predatory publisher at one time, is now in the UBC library listing of open access publisher discounts. In other words, discounts that you are able to obtain to publish open access by virtue of being part of UBC's community. And you know for sure that UBC would not be listing a publishing house as worthy of a discount in open access publication unless it determined it had some credibility. So you'll see MDPI, the publishing house, being listed as among those that have discounts, which is another sign that UBC has decided that that's a credible publication. Now, one of the mechanisms I want to bring to your attention that has been used, certainly not exclusively by predatory publishers, but it can be quite devious in the hands of predatory publishers, is the special issue guest editor invitation. It typically communicates with you and links a topic in your field. So they will have targeted you personally in this context. It won't look like a field that's totally out of your world. It is inviting you specifically to be a special editor of a special issue, which sounds like a wonderful thing. And in a legitimate journal, that can be a very important thing to do, to be able to gather a group of people together to create a special issue that's all on your topic. Now, in the predatory world, this kind of feature will try and attract you by indicating that your own papers will not have an article processing fee, but they will not only list you as the special issue guest editor on their website, but they would also expect you to reach out personally to many of your own colleagues in that field to invite a paper for this special issue. So in other words, they're using you as their marketing technique so that you will bring in other authors who will then themselves pay the article processing fee to have their papers published. So the hard part about this is that once you're caught into it, that your name and your reputation may be used to bring people into a publishing situation that is not serving them well. And you can imagine that that's not something you would want to get involved in. So I encourage those of you who are more senior in your academic career and might be approached with this kind of inquiry to look very deeply into the journal and its practices before you accept that kind of an invitation. There's nothing wrong with inviting your colleagues to be part of something for which, if accepted, they will pay an article processing fee, but it really would be very destructive for you to be using your name and reputation to coerce their publications into a journal that is not credible. And so in this role, I encourage you in particular to make sure it's not just you putting yourself at risk by a quick submission to the wrong journal, but you're potentially guiding other scholars in your field in that direction. And none of us would want to have that. Another similar kind of tactic that's very worrisome is the editorial board or editor appointments. I'm using the example of this one publishing group which has many journals. OMIC is very clearly, I think, a predatory publisher, and I'm not aware of any OMIC publications that have been able to meet any bars of credible publications. It has hundreds of 700 journals, as you can see. So it's a big conglomerate, and you can look it up on Wikipedia. But one of the tactics that's used by this group and others invite you to be either an editorial board or an editor of a journal. This one I posted in particular because I think that most of us in nursing would be absolutely horrified by its definition of nursing. So go look this up, and you will be a little bit horrified by the way in which this journal even conceptualizes nursing. So clearly it has not got anybody who truly understands our discipline making those sorts of decisions. But the example that I wanted to raise here is a journal of community and public health, which is one of their journals, and a journal that obviously does attract a significant number of nursing publications. The person who is named as the editor-in-chief is in Saudi Arabia. There are a number of other people listed on the editorial board. One of them, and the reason I bring this example to your attention, is a Canadian professor at a legitimate university. Now, I do not know this individual, and I do not know whether this individual has allowed her name to be there or is aware that her name is there. But I think that this is one of the tactics that is used by these journals. They may reach out to somebody and say, we would just love it if you would be in our editorial board. And actually, you won't have to do much work. We won't make you do any reviewing of manuscripts or anything, but we'd like to list you on our editorial board. And for faculty and others who are building their academic record, who are seeking, wanting to have such things on their record for promotion and that kind of thing, it's very tempting to say yes. So I would never agree to any kind of editorial board naming unless you are very confident that it's a journal that you feel comfortable with. It may also be, though, that this individual does not know that she has been named. We did a project in the International Academy at one time of looking on such journals for North American colleagues in universities that we knew and reaching out to them to say, were you aware? And because you're being used as credibility to bring in other scholars, a young scholar might look at this and say, oh, I recognize that faculty member, I recognize that university, this must be a credible journal. Unfortunately, we found some individuals who knew that it wasn't a credible journal, but were not prepared to ask to have their name removed. We found other situations in which people have been horrified to see that their name was used without their awareness. They may have responded to an inquiry or something like that, but they have not given permission, and when they ask to have their name removed, that might take a very, very long time. So I don't know the circumstances of this individual, but I use this as an example, just as a cautionary tale, to be very, very careful that your name and university's reputation are never used as a way of these journals soliciting the most vulnerable of members of our communities who may be desperate to publish, may have been rejected by what we consider the more mainstream journals, and would see this as a legitimacy factor that would cause them to feel comfortable enough to submit. You can see this name of Journal on Community and Public Health might well seem to somebody a legitimate journal. It's easy to confuse it with other journals in the field, and I give these as examples of journals in legitimate publishing houses that are entirely credible journals. So someone may, seeing the title of Journal of Community and Public Health, say, oh yeah, I've seen that, I've read articles, I know that that's a credible publication. It's the kind of name you might see as credible. The silly names tend not to last because people recognize that they're silly, but this is a name that might well strike somebody as, I'm sure I know that journal. I'm sure I read articles in that journal. And to really mistake it for one of these more credible ones. Newer entity, it's not brand new now, but it is newer than the predatory publishers, is the predatory conferences. And many of you may now be receiving multiple invitations day after day to present at certain fields. The form for these, as with some of the publishers, the predatory publishers know you won't republish a manuscript you've already had published. So in their algorithms, the way where they set up their email templates to try and target you, they often include the title of something you've recently published. Now this one has obviously not paid any attention to matching the theme of the conference that they're hosting with the title of the publication, but they've included a title which gives that aura of credibility, that they know who you are and that they think you'd be a useful speaker. They often name that they'd like you to be a plenary speaker or a keynote speaker or something like that, and then they invite you to sort of begin a conversation with them that will allow you to agree to do that, possibly being posted on their website now as one of the speakers so that they can attract others. And many of these conferences really are not legitimate conferences at all, whether they're virtual or they're otherwise. As a speaker, they might claim they're giving you a reduced fee, although they are not paying you to speak. But they may well use your name to bring in other people, or to, if people see that there are a large number of Canadians presenting at something, they would think that that must be credible in the Canadian scene. Again, they have websites that can often look very slick. Many of these companies are developing conferences in a million fields at once. So they'll just think of, anything that they can think of that they can create a conference in, that they would create. And again, these are the people who are vulnerable to this, who are so excited because they got invited as a speaker and pay a little money and go, may find that they go halfway around the world in the olden days before COVID and sit in a room with 6 people all in different fields and have a, coffee and a cookies, and that might be the extent of the conference. So they're fraudulent conferences for the most part. They will host something virtually or otherwise, but there is no benefit to your career to be involved in these. And, if you look into the details of the websites, you can start to see all kinds of language that would cause you to wonder, is this the nature of an organization that is delivering a legitimate conference? They're describing themselves as a budding conference organization, and they started doing predatory publication and then evolved into conferences. And you can see another example of the wide range of topics and the slick websites they will create for these to give you that aura of credibility. So the bottom line guidance I want to leave you with is really always to be suspicious, especially of any solicitations, and especially if they flatter you. Be very, very careful never to click on a link or to just put that aside and say, "Whoa, that's great. I'm glad they asked because that's exactly what I want to do with this paper I've got in the process." Look below the surface. Don't hesitate to Google the name of the publishing house to figure out what it is on the journal website, and then Google the name along with Predatory. Is OMIC Predatory? Is pretty quick to Google, and it won't take you long to be able to quickly find out that it is. And groups like Wikipedia and others do a lot to try and continue to bring this to our attention. Obviously, the websites of these organizations won't tell you that, but it doesn't take much searching to find that if you're willing to look below the surface. If you see grammatical English language use errors, that would be a pretty quick sign. Some of them are pretty funny and they're worth saving, but they're a pretty quick sign, because no credible publishing house which specializes in providing meticulous accuracy in published work would ever have a website or have materials that would have such errors in them. Also know that it's a changing field, so look for current guidance. A journal that may have struck you as being questionable 5 years ago may have worked extremely hard to now be credible and might be a legitimate place to publish, particularly if it's found a unique niche. Don't be afraid to talk to colleagues about it. I think the conversations we have will protect us all. And pay attention to any alarm bell at all that goes off. I've alerted you to quite a few of them, but if anything attracts your spidey senses by saying this isn't quite right, they're too enthusiastic, they accepted the paper too quickly, any of these issues is worth paying attention to. And even if you think you've gone down the path, you submitted and you later think, I'm not sure that was the right one, do reach out for help. There have been situations in which our colleagues have submitted to a journal, then realized that they probably had made an error, and it may not be too late. If a journal is trying to gain credibility, it may be willing to release that paper back to you, which means you're allowed to submit it to another journal. If it's a hardcore predator, you may have lost that permanently. But the minute you have some sense that something might not be quite right, feel free to reach out for help. Anyway, it's a Shark Tank we're all in. It's a complicated world and it's an evolving world. But I hope that these reflections have helped you feel just a little bit more confident that there are many things you can do to be absolutely certain that all of your wonderful scholarly work is presented or published in places that are credible and will stand the test of time.